The morning dew clung to the leaves, glistening like tiny diamonds in the pale light of dawn. Sally's hands were already stained with soil as she knelt in her family's garden, her fingers tenderly coaxing a sprout from the earth. The scent of fresh dirt and blooming flowers filled the air, a familiar, comforting aroma that grounded her amidst the chaos that had begun to swirl around her life. She had always found solace here, in the quiet embrace of nature. The garden was a sanctuary, a place where the world's troubles couldn't reach her. But today, even the comforting rustle of leaves couldn't quiet the storm that raged inside her. Her mother's fragile voice still echoed in her ears, repeating the words that had upended her life just days ago. "We can't make it through the winter," Sally, her mother, Margaret, had said, her voice trembling with both age and exhaustion. "The crops aren't enough this year. We're going to lose the farm." Sally had stared at her mother, disbelief and fear warring in her chest. The farm was everything to them. It had been their home for generations, passed down from mother to daughter, the land as much a part of their family as the blood that ran through their veins. Losing it was unthinkable. Margaret's frail hands had grasped Sally's, her eyes full of sorrow. "You're strong, Sally. Stronger than I ever was. You're the only one who can save us now. You have to go to the city. There's work there, money. It's our only chance." The city. The word itself felt foreign on Sally's tongue. She had never been further than the neighboring town, never wanted to. The city was loud, chaotic, full of people who didn't know her, didn't care. But her mother's plea had left her with no choice. She had to go. For her mother. For the farm. For the roots that bound her to this land. As the sun began to rise, casting long shadows across the garden, Sally stood, brushing the dirt from her hands. She gazed out at the fields, the rows of vegetables she had nurtured with love and care. This place was in her blood, and leaving it felt like tearing herself in two. But she couldn't stay. Not anymore. She walked back to the small farmhouse, the wooden floorboards creaking under her weight as she entered. Inside, her mother sat by the window, her knitting needles clicking softly. Margaret looked up as Sally approached, her eyes tired but warm. "Are you ready, dear?" Margaret asked, her voice laced with both hope and fear. Sally nodded, swallowing the lump in her throat. "I'm ready, Mama." Margaret reached out and took Sally's hand, squeezing it gently. "You'll do great, Sally. You've always had a strength in you, a resilience that even the hardest times couldn't break." Sally smiled faintly, though her heart was heavy. "I just wish I didn't have to leave you." Margaret's eyes softened, and she shook her head. "I'll be fine, my dear. You're doing this for us, for our family. And I'm so proud of you." Sally's resolve hardened. She would not let her mother down. She would go to the city, find work, and bring back enough money to save their home. It was the only way. But as she packed her bag and kissed her mother goodbye, the gnawing fear of the unknown lingered in the back of her mind. The bus ride to the city was long and uncomfortable. The landscape outside the window changed gradually, the rolling hills and green fields giving way to crowded streets and towering skyscrapers. Sally clutched her bag tightly, feeling more and more out of place with every mile that passed. The city loomed ahead of her like a great beast, ready to swallow her whole. When the bus finally pulled into the station, Sally stepped off, feeling like a fish out of water. The noise was overwhelming, cars honking, people shouting, the constant hum of life in the city that never seemed to stop. She took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. This was it. Her new life. She had to be strong. Sally found her way to the residential condominium where she had been promised a job as a gardener. The building was a stark contrast to the modest farmhouse she had grown up in, tall, sleek, and modern, with polished glass windows that reflected the sky. She felt small and insignificant as she approached the entrance, but she squared her shoulders and pushed open the door. Inside, the lobby was bustling with activity. Wealthy residents in designer clothes strolled by, barely glancing at her as they passed. Sally felt a pang of discomfort, but she reminded herself that this was temporary. She was here to work, to save her family's farm. Nothing else mattered. A middle-aged man in a crisp suit approached her, his expression all business. "You must be Sally Lawson," he said, glancing at the clipboard in his hand. "Welcome. I'm Mr. Thompson, the property manager. Follow me, and I'll show you to the gardens." Sally nodded, following him through the pristine corridors. As they walked, she couldn't help but notice the stark contrast between the cold, sterile environment of the condominium and the warm, living world of the countryside she had left behind. The gardens, when they finally reached them, were beautiful but artificial. Manicured hedges, perfectly placed flowers, everything was controlled, precise. It lacked the wild beauty of the earth she knew so well. Mr. Thompson turned to her. "Your job is to maintain these gardens. We expect nothing less than perfection. The residents here are very particular about appearances, so you'll need to stay on top of things." Sally nodded, her stomach knotting with anxiety. "I understand." He handed her a set of tools and a list of tasks. "You start tomorrow morning. Good luck." As Mr. Thompson walked away, Sally stood in the middle of the garden, feeling both overwhelmed and determined. This wasn't what she was used to, but she would adapt. She had to. For her family's sake. The next morning, Sally began her work, her hands moving instinctively through the soil, pruning, planting, and watering. But as the days passed, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was missing. The city was a place of constant movement, of people rushing from one thing to the next without pause, without connection. She missed the quiet moments, the simple joy of watching a seed grow into something beautiful. One afternoon, as she was trimming the hedges near the penthouse garden, she heard a voice behind her. "You have a natural touch." Startled, Sally turned to see a tall man with silver hair and piercing blue eyes. He was dressed impeccably, his presence commanding. This was Harvey Simpson, the building's wealthiest resident. Sally had heard whispers about him, how he kept to himself, how he rarely spoke to anyone. But now, here he was, standing in front of her, watching her work. "Thank you," Sally replied, unsure of what else to say. Harvey studied her for a moment, his gaze lingering on her hands as they worked the clippers. "You remind me of someone I once knew." Sally felt a strange flutter in her chest at his words. "I'm just doing my job, sir." He nodded slowly, as if lost in thought. "Yes, of course. But you're different. There's a care in what you do. Most people here see the garden as just another decoration, something to impress the neighbors. But you see it as something alive, something worth nurturing." Sally didn't know how to respond to that, so she stayed silent, focusing on her task. But she couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this conversation than simple compliments. Harvey continued to watch her for a moment longer before he spoke again. "Would you be interested in a more permanent position? At my estate, outside the city. The gardens there are extensive. They could use someone with your skill." Sally hesitated, her heart pounding. The offer was tempting, a chance to escape the suffocating city, to work in a place that felt more like home. But there was something about Harvey's intense gaze, something that made her uneasy. "I'll think about it," she replied carefully. Harvey nodded, seeming satisfied with her answer. "Take your time. But don't take too long. Opportunities like this don't come around often." As he walked away, Sally stood there, her mind racing. The city had been overwhelming, but now, faced with this unexpected offer, she felt a new kind of fear. There was something in Harvey's words, in his eyes, that hinted at a deeper connection, something that went beyond the garden and the job. She didn't know what it was, but she knew that her life was about to change in ways she couldn't yet understand. That night, as she lay in her small apartment, staring at the ceiling, Sally thought about her mother, about the farm, about the life she had left behind. She had come to the city to save her family, but now it seemed like the city had its own plans for her. She felt the weight of responsibility pressing down on her, but also a flicker of hope. Maybe this was her chance to do more than just survive. Maybe this was her chance to grow, to find out who she really was. But even as she tried to hold on to that hope, the unease lingered, a shadow in the corner of her mind. She couldn't shake the feeling that Harvey Simpson's offer was just the beginning of something much bigger, and much more dangerous, than she had ever imagined. Sally stared out the window of the sleek black car as it wound its way through the dense woods, the city slowly receding behind her. The air grew cooler, fresher, as the towering skyscrapers gave way to towering trees. The landscape softened, became wilder, freer. For the first time in weeks, Sally felt a sense of peace beginning to settle over her, like the world was slowing down, giving her space to breathe. But beneath that peace was a tension she couldn't quite shake. Harvey Simpson's offer had come out of nowhere, a lifeline thrown at her when she was sinking into the overwhelming world of the city. Yet, as much as she wanted to believe in the opportunity, something about it felt too good to be true. The way Harvey had looked at her, the way he had spoken her name with a mix of familiarity and disbelief, there was something deeper going on, something she couldn't yet see. As the car pulled up to the gates of Harvey's estate, Sally's breath caught in her throat. The mansion loomed ahead, a grand structure of stone and glass that seemed to rise organically from the earth, blending with the wild landscape around it. It was beautiful, but there was an emptiness to it, a coldness that made her shiver despite the warmth of the day. The driver opened the door for her, and Sally stepped out, her feet sinking into the graveled driveway. Harvey was waiting for her on the steps, his sharp blue eyes unreadable as he watched her approach. "Welcome to your new home," he said with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. Sally nodded, forcing a smile in return. "Thank you, Mr. Simpson. Please, call me Harvey," he replied, waving a hand dismissively. "Come inside. I'll show you around." As they walked through the mansion, Sally couldn't help but feel a sense of awe. The interiors were exquisite, every detail meticulously crafted, from the polished marble floors to the ornate chandeliers that cast a warm glow over the rooms. Yet, beneath the opulence, there was a sense of loneliness, as if the house itself were a hollow shell, waiting to be filled with life. Harvey led her through the long corridors, his voice low as he explained the history of the estate. But Sally's mind was elsewhere, her thoughts drifting back to her mother, to the farm she had left behind. She had come here to save her family, but now she wasn't so sure if this was the right path. Finally, they reached the gardens, and Sally's breath caught in her throat. The estate's grounds were vast, stretching out in every direction, a wild and untamed paradise. There were rows of roses in full bloom, ancient trees casting deep shadows over the paths, and winding streams that sparkled in the sunlight. It was the most beautiful garden she had ever seen, and yet, there was something about it that felt familiar. "I had this garden designed by the best landscapers in the world," Harvey said, his voice cutting through her thoughts. "But no matter how much money I spent, it never quite turned out the way I imagined. I think you'll be able to bring it to life in a way that they couldn't." Sally frowned, looking up at him. "Why do you think that?" Harvey smiled, but there was a sadness in his eyes. "Because you remind me of someone who once did." Sally's heart skipped a beat. "Who?" He hesitated, then sighed, his gaze drifting over the garden as if he were seeing something that wasn't there. "A long time ago, I loved a woman named Margaret. She was like you, strong, connected to the earth in a way that few people are. She had a way of making everything she touched grow, blossom. But she's gone now." Sally's breath caught in her throat. Margaret. Her mother's name. The same name. The name that had haunted her since she had met Harvey. Could it be the same woman? Could Harvey be talking about her mother? Sally tried to keep her voice steady as she spoke. "What happened to her?" Harvey's face darkened, his jaw tightening. "She died. Or at least, that's what I was told. But I never found her body, never had closure. I've lived with that uncertainty for years. And now, seeing that necklace." Sally's hand instinctively went to the silver necklace around her neck, the one her mother had given her before she left for the city. It was a simple pendant, but it had always been special to her. Now, she wondered if it was more than just a family heirloom. "Where did you get that necklace?" Harvey asked, his voice low and intense. Sally hesitated, her mind racing. Should she tell him the truth? Should she reveal the connection that was slowly becoming impossible to ignore? Or should she protect her mother's secrets, the ones that had clearly been buried for a reason? It was my mother's, Sally finally said, her voice trembling. She gave it to me when I was a child. Harvey's eyes widened, a mix of hope and fear flickering across his face. Your mother. What's her name? Sally swallowed hard, her heart pounding in her chest. Margaret Lawson. For a moment, there was silence, a heavy stillness that seemed to hang in the air between them. Then, Harvey staggered back, his face pale as a ghost. No, he whispered, shaking his head. It can't be. She's dead. She's been dead for years. Sally's mind whirled as the pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place. Her mother, the farm, the city, Harvey's strange behavior, everything was connected. But how? And why had her mother hidden this part of her life from her? I don't understand, Sally said, her voice barely above a whisper. What happened between you and my mother? Harvey looked at her, his eyes filled with a deep, aching sadness. She left me. Disappeared without a trace. I searched for her for years, but all I ever found were dead ends. Eventually, I was told that she had died in an accident. But now I'm not so sure. Sally's head spun with the weight of this revelation. Her mother was alive, but she had faked her own death. Why? What had driven her to leave Harvey, to leave everything behind? I need to talk to her, Sally said, her voice firm. I need to understand what happened. Harvey nodded, though there was a wariness in his eyes. I understand. But be careful, Sally. There are things in the past that are best left buried. Sally met his gaze, her resolve hardening. I need to know the truth. That night, Sally called her mother, her hands shaking as she dialed the familiar number. The phone rang, once, twice, then a soft voice answered. Sally? Is everything okay? Margaret's voice was filled with concern, the worry of a mother who had always been protective of her only child. Sally took a deep breath, her heart pounding in her chest. Mama, I need to ask you something. And I need you to be honest with me. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. What is it, Sally? Who is Harvey Simpson? The silence that followed was deafening. Sally could hear her mother's sharp intake of breath, could feel the tension in the air even through the phone. Sally. How do you know that name? I'm working for him, Sally said, her voice steady despite the storm of emotions swirling inside her. And he knows you. Or at least, he thinks he does. Mama, what happened between you two? Another long pause, then a sigh, heavy with years of secrets and regret. I never wanted you to find out this way. I wanted to protect you. Protect me from what? Sally demanded, her voice rising. From the truth? From my own father. Margaret's voice broke, a sob caught in her throat. Yes. From the truth. Because the truth isn't as simple as you think, Sally. There are things you don't know, things that I never wanted you to carry. Sally's heart ached at the pain in her mother's voice, but she knew she couldn't back down. Not now. Mama, please. I need to know. I need to understand. There was a long silence, then Margaret spoke, her voice trembling. Your father. Harvey. He loved me. And I loved him. But my father, your grandfather, he didn't approve. He said that Harvey was dangerous, that he would destroy our family. So, I did what I thought was best. I left. I let him believe I was dead, all to protect you. Tears welled in Sally's eyes as she listened to her mother's confession. The weight of the secrets, the lies, the years of separation, it all crashed down on her, suffocating in its intensity. But Mama, what if you were wrong? What if he wasn't dangerous? What if? What if you destroyed our family by leaving? Margaret's voice broke again, her sobs audible through the phone. I don't know, Sally. I don't know anymore. All I wanted was to keep you safe. But maybe I made a terrible mistake. Sally closed her eyes, tears streaming down her cheeks. The truth had been revealed, but it wasn't the simple, clear-cut answer she had hoped for. It was messy, complicated, and filled with pain. "I need to see you," Sally said softly. "We need to talk. Face to face." Margaret sniffed, trying to compose herself. Yes, we do. Come home, Sally. We'll figure this out together." As Sally hung up the phone, she felt a sense of both relief and dread. The truth had been uncovered, but it had only raised more questions, more doubts. She had thought she knew who she was, where she came from. But now, everything was uncertain. And yet, in that uncertainty, there was also the possibility of growth, of healing. Sally knew that she was at a crossroads, a moment that would define the rest of her life. She could either run from the truth, bury it like her mother had, or she could face it head-on and find a way to reconcile the past with the present. As she lay in bed that night, staring up at the ceiling, Sally made her decision. She would return home. She would confront her mother, her grandfather, and Harvey. She would dig deeper into the roots of her family's history, no matter how painful it might be. Because only by uncovering the past could she truly understand who she was, and who she wanted to become. The sun dipped low in the sky as Sally returned to the estate, the golden light casting long shadows across the mansion's grand facade. The journey back from her mother's farm had left her emotionally drained, but she knew that her quest for the truth was far from over. The conversation with her mother had answered some questions, but it had also opened up new ones. Harvey, her father, who had believed her mother dead for so many years, deserved to know the truth. But how would he react to the revelation that Margaret was alive and had kept their daughter hidden from him? The garden, once a place of solace for Sally, now felt like a labyrinth of secrets. As she walked through the familiar paths, her mind churned with uncertainty. Every bloom, every vine seemed to whisper stories of a past she had only just begun to unravel. As she approached the main house, she saw Harvey standing by the fountain at the center of the garden, lost in thought. His usual confident demeanor seemed diminished, weighed down by the revelations of the past few days. Sally took a deep breath and walked over to him, her footsteps crunching on the gravel. "Harvey," she called softly. He turned to face her, his eyes filled with a mixture of hope and fear. "Sally, did you talk to your mother?" Sally nodded, her heart aching at the sight of the man who had unknowingly been absent from her life for so long. "I did. And she told me everything." Harvey's gaze sharpened. "Is she alive?" "Yes," Sally whispered, her voice heavy with emotion. "She's alive. She faked her death to protect me. And to protect herself from what she thought you might do." Harvey staggered back, as if the words had physically struck him. He ran a hand through his silver hair, his eyes distant as he tried to process what Sally had just said. She thought I was dangerous? That I would hurt her? She was scared, Sally explained gently. My grandfather convinced her that being with you would destroy our family. She believed she had no choice but to leave. To let you think she was gone. Harvey clenched his fists, anger and sorrow warring within him. I spent years searching for her. I never gave up hope, even when everyone else told me to move on. And all this time, she was alive, hiding from me? Sally reached out and placed a hand on his arm, grounding him in the present. She was trying to protect me. She thought she was doing the right thing. Harvey looked down at her, his expression softening. And what about you, Sally? How do you feel about all of this? About me? Sally hesitated, her own emotions tangled in a web of confusion and longing. I'm still trying to figure that out. Part of me is angry that I never knew the truth, angry that so much of my life was built on lies. But another part of me wants to get to know you. To understand who you are, and why my mother loved you so much. Harvey's eyes glistened with unshed tears. I want that too, Sally. More than anything. A long silence stretched between them, filled with unspoken emotions. Finally, Sally spoke again, her voice steady and determined. But before we can move forward, we need to confront the past, together. Harvey nodded, his jaw set with resolve. I agree. We'll bring your mother here. We'll talk. And we'll find a way to heal. The next day, Sally stood on the steps of the mansion, watching as her mother's old car pulled up the long driveway. The tension in the air was palpable, like the heavy weight of an impending storm. Sally had insisted on driving her mother to the estate herself, despite Margaret's reluctance. She knew that this confrontation was inevitable. Years of secrets and lies had to be faced. Margaret stepped out of the car, her eyes wide as she took in the sight of the mansion. She hadn't seen it in decades, and the memories it held clearly weighed heavily on her. She looked fragile, as if the weight of her past might break her. "Are you ready?" Sally asked softly, her heart aching for her mother. Margaret nodded, though her face was pale. "I have to be." Together, they walked up the steps and into the mansion. Harvey was waiting for them in the grand foyer, his face a mask of controlled emotion. For a moment, the three of them stood in silence, the enormity of the moment pressing down on them. "Harvey," Margaret finally said, her voice trembling. "Margaret," Harvey replied, his voice barely more than a whisper. The years seemed to fall away as they looked at each other, the history between them palpable. Finally, Harvey broke the silence, his voice thick with emotion. "Why, Margaret? Why did you leave me?" Margaret's eyes filled with tears. "I thought I was protecting Sally. My father. He convinced me that you were dangerous, that you would tear our family apart. I didn't know what to do. I was scared, and I made a terrible mistake." Harvey's hands trembled as he stepped closer to her. "I would have done anything for you, Margaret. I never would have hurt you. I know that now," Margaret whispered, her voice cracking. "But back then, I didn't see any other way. I thought I was doing what was best for our daughter." Sally watched as her parents stood before each other, the pain and regret of the past decades laid bare. But in that pain, she also saw something else: love. A love that had been buried under layers of fear and misunderstanding but had never truly died. "I'm sorry, Harvey," Margaret said, her voice breaking. "I'm so sorry for everything." Harvey closed his eyes, taking a deep, shuddering breath. When he opened them again, there was a softness there, a willingness to forgive. "I forgive you, Margaret. But we can't change the past. We can only try to build a future, together." Tears streamed down Margaret's cheeks as she nodded. "I want that. More than anything." Sally felt a lump rise in her throat as she watched her parents, two people who had been separated for so long, begin to bridge the gap that had kept them apart. But she knew that this was only the beginning. The wounds of the past wouldn't heal overnight, and the road ahead would be difficult. Yet, as they stood there together, she felt a glimmer of hope. They were a family, broken, yes, but not beyond repair. In the days that followed, Sally worked in the garden with a renewed sense of purpose. The mansion, once cold and empty, began to feel like a home again. Harvey and Margaret spent hours talking, reconnecting in ways that Sally had never thought possible. And for the first time in her life, Sally felt a sense of belonging, a sense that she was exactly where she was meant to be. But the garden, with all its beauty, still held its secrets. One afternoon, as Sally was tending to the roses, she noticed something unusual. Beneath the roots of an old oak tree, there was a small, weathered box, half buried in the soil. Intrigued, she carefully unearthed it and opened the lid. Inside was a collection of letters that had clearly been written years ago. The ink was faded, the paper yellowed with age, but the words were still legible. They were love letters, written by her mother to Harvey. Letters that had never been sent. As Sally read through them, her heart ached with the depth of her mother's love and regret. These letters told a different story, a story of a woman who had been torn between duty and desire, who had sacrificed her happiness for the sake of her child. But they also revealed something else: Margaret had never stopped loving Harvey. She had always intended to return, to explain everything, but the fear of rejection had kept her away. Sally knew what she had to do. That evening, she brought the letters to her parents. As they read through them together, there were tears, tears of sorrow, of longing, of lost time. But there was also healing. The letters became a bridge between the past and the present, a way for Margaret and Harvey to understand each other in ways they never had before. By the time the last letter was read, the weight of the past seemed to lift, replaced by a sense of peace. They were no longer haunted by what could have been. They were ready to embrace what was, and what could be. The garden bloomed more beautifully than ever in the months that followed. Sally's touch seemed to bring life to everything she planted, and the once empty mansion became a place of warmth and love. Harvey, Margaret, and Sally began to rebuild their lives together, finding joy in the simple moments of family life that they had all missed for so long. But the journey wasn't without its challenges. There were still scars that needed time to heal, still moments of doubt and fear. Yet, through it all, they held on to each other, determined to create a new future, one that was rooted in love, honesty, and forgiveness. One evening, as the sun set over the garden, Sally sat with her parents on the porch, watching the sky turn shades of pink and orange. The air was filled with the scent of blooming flowers, and the sound of crickets chirping in the distance. Harvey turned to Sally, his eyes filled with pride. "You've done wonders with this garden, Sally. It's like you've brought it back to life." Sally smiled, her heart full. "I think we all have, Dad." Together. Margaret reached out and took both their hands, her voice soft but strong. "This is our garden now. Our home. And we'll keep tending it, no matter what." As they sat there, hand in hand, Sally knew that they had come full circle. The garden, once a place of secrets and pain, had become a symbol of growth and renewal. And in that garden, Sally had found her place, her roots, her identity, and the family she had always longed for. The end of one chapter had become the beginning of another. And for Sally, Harvey, and Margaret, the future held endless possibilities, like a garden that would continue to bloom, season after season. If you like this story, please subscribe, like, click the bell, and leave a comment. Thank you in advance.